Get out!" The auctioneer didn't even look at her. He just pointed at the door, the way a man points at a dog that wandered into the wrong yard. Clara Whitman stood in the middle of what used to be her father's study and watched a stranger carry out the mahogany desk that had held 20 years of her family's letters, their debts, their dreams. Her mother's piano went next. She counted every step the men took toward the door. She did not cry. She had already decided if she was going to lose everything, she was going to choose what came next. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and follow Clara's story all the way to the end. And drop a comment below, telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning they auctioned her family's home, Clara Whitman woke up before dawn and made herself a cup of tea with the last of the good leaves. She sat at the kitchen table, the one piece of furniture the creditors had temporarily overlooked because it wasn't worth carrying, and she drank her tea slowly, deliberately, the way her mother had taught her. "You drink it like it matters," her mother used to say, even when nothing else does. Clara's mother had been dead 3 years. Her father had followed her 8 months later, and whatever peace he'd found in death, he'd left behind a ledger full of unpaid debts, 2 mortgages on a house that had once been worth something, and a daughter with a college education, and exactly $11.40 to her name. The auction had been scheduled for 9 o'clock. By 8:30, the men were already at the door. "Miss Whitman." The man in charge had the decency to remove his hat, but his eyes were already moving past her, already calculating. "We'll need you to step aside while we inventory." "I know what you need," Clara said. "I've read the paperwork twice." She stepped aside. She stood in the hallway and she watched them move through her childhood home with their clipboards and their indifference, and she felt something inside her go very quiet and very cold. Not grief, she'd spent grief already in the weeks since the bank's letter arrived. What she felt now was something sharper, something that had edges. Her neighbor Mrs. Aldrich appeared at the front door with a shawl around her shoulders and a casserole dish in her hands, which was the Boston way of announcing that a woman was finished. "Oh, Clara," Mrs. Aldrich said. "Oh, you poor dear." "Thank you, Mrs. Aldrich." "Where will you go?" "Do you have family?" "Your aunt in Providence." "My aunt in Providence made it very clear last month that she has 4 children and 1 income and no room for a 5th mouth." Clara kept her voice level. "Which I understand completely." Mrs. Aldrich set the casserole on the hallway table. "What about that position at the school?" Mrs. Henderson said. "Mrs. Henderson's school has 12 applicants for 2 positions, and both of those positions pay $4 a week." Clara did the arithmetic the way she'd been doing it for 2 months, automatically without mercy. "Rent on a decent room is $2.50. That leaves $1.50 for food, clothing, and everything else. Which is possible. It's been done." She paused. It's not a life, Mrs. Aldrich. It's a calculation." Mrs. Aldrich looked at her with the particular kind of pity that well-fed women reserve for women who are about to fall, and Clara felt the cold thing inside her get colder still. "You're very brave," Mrs. Aldrich said. "I'm very practical," Clara said. "There's a difference." She excused herself. She went upstairs to her bedroom, still hers for another 4 hours. The paperwork had been very specific, and she opened the cedar box on her dresser where she kept her important papers. Letters from her father, her mother's recipe book, her college certificate from Miss Whitmore's academy, which had cost her father 3 years of careful saving, and which had given her in the brutal accounting of 1889 almost no practical value whatsoever. And underneath all of that, a folded newspaper page she'd torn out 6 weeks ago from a copy of the Boston Herald that someone had left on a bench in the park. She unfolded it now. The advertisement was in the 3rd column, small and direct. Wanted a woman of good character and honest disposition to serve as wife and partner on a working cattle ranch in Stillwater, Montana. The life is hard, and I will not pretend otherwise. I am a widower, 32, with no children. I require a capable partner, not a romantic notion. If you are willing to work and willing to be honest, write to Eli Tanner, Stillwater, Montana. I will do the same. She had read it 6 times when she first found it. She had read it every day since. She had not written back. She had told herself she was considering it. She had told herself it was a last resort. She had told herself any number of things, and downstairs the auctioneer's voice carried through the floorboards as he described her mother's piano to a room full of strangers. Clara Whitman sat on the edge of her bed, unfolded the advertisement one more time and said aloud to no one, "All right then." She went to her writing desk. She uncapped her pen. She wrote, "Dear Mr. Tanner, my name is Clara Whitman. I am 23 years old, educated in good health, and I have just watched everything I owned sold at auction. I am not a romantic notion. I am a woman who needs a life and is willing to build one honestly. If that is what you're looking for, I am prepared to discuss it." She sealed it before she could reconsider. She put on her coat and walked to the post office herself, past the men carrying her father's desk, through the front door, past Mrs. Aldrich, watching from the sidewalk, past the life she was leaving piece by piece. She mailed the letter. Then she went back and finished her tea. His reply came in 11 days. She was staying at a women's boarding house on Tremont Street by then, $2.25 a week, shared room, no cooking privileges after 8, and she read his letter standing in the narrow hallway because there was nowhere private to sit. Miss Whitman, your letter was the most honest one I received. I have had 14 responses to my advertisement. Most of them told me what they thought I wanted to hear. Yours told me what was true. I respect that. The life here is harder than I described, which should tell you something about how hard it actually is. Montana winters are not like anything you have experienced. The work is physical, constant, and unforgiving. I had a wife once. She came here expecting one thing and found another, and I believe that was my fault for not being plain enough. I am being plain now. If you come, I will give you 6 months to decide if this life is something you can accept. You are not obligated to stay. I will not hold you to anything until you choose freely. I need a partner, not a prisoner. Write back if you are still willing. Eli Tanner. Clara read it twice. Then she went upstairs to the shared room, sat on her narrow half of the bed, while her roommate slept and thought about the word prisoner. She thought about the calculation: $4 a week, $2.50 for rent, $1.50 for everything else. She thought about her college certificate in the cedar box, which proved she could read Chaucer in the original and solve differential equations, but could not apparently secure her own future. She thought about her aunt in Providence who had 4 children and no room. She thought about Mrs. Aldrich's casserole and Mrs. Aldrich's pity. She thought about Eli Tanner, who had said, "I need a partner, not a prisoner," to a woman he had never met because he thought she deserved to know. She wrote back that same night, "I am still willing. Tell me what I need to know." What followed was 3 weeks of letters, fast and frank, crossing each other in transit, so that sometimes she was answering a question he'd already answered himself, and the letters accumulated on her half of the boarding house dresser, in a stack that her roommate, a factory girl named Ruth, regarded with open curiosity. "Is he handsome?" Ruth asked one evening. "He doesn't say," Clara said. "Does he have money?" "He has a ranch. He says it's profitable in good years and survivable in bad ones." Ruth considered this. "That's not a ringing endorsement." "No," Clara agreed, "but it's honest." Ruth sat up and looked at her directly. "Clara, you know what most mail-order brides end up with, don't you? You've read the papers." "I've read the papers," Clara said. "I've also read all 11 of his letters. He's answered every question I asked him. He's never once said anything designed to flatter me." She paused. "He told me his last wife was unhappy there. He told me he thought it was his fault. What kind of man admits that to a stranger he's trying to convince to come?" Ruth was quiet for a moment. "An honest one," she said finally. "Or a very clever one." "I know," Clara said. "I've thought about that. And I've decided I'd rather bet on honesty than die of arithmetic." Ruth looked at her for a long time. Then she lay back down and pulled the covers up and said, "Well, write me when you get there." The last letter he sent included a train ticket. She held it in her hands and felt something shift in her chest. Not excitement, not exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that recognized a door opening. She had 2 full days before the departure. She spent them methodically. She sold what little she'd kept from the house. Her father's watch. 2 books she'd carried with her for years. A silver bracelet that had been her grandmother's. She packed her trunk with everything she was taking into her new life. 3 good dresses. 2 practical ones. Her warmest coat. Her mother's recipe book. Her college certificate, because she didn't know what else to do with it. And the stack of Eli Tanner's letters tied with a piece of string. She went to the boarding house office and settled her account. Mrs. Fenton, who ran the place with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had seen everything, counted the coins without looking up. "Montana," Mrs. Fenton said. "Mail order situation." "Yes," Clara said. Mrs. Fenton finished counting and looked up. "You seem like a sensible girl." "I try to be. Sensible girls sometimes do very unsensible things when they're desperate." Mrs. Fenton studied her. "Are you desperate, Miss Whitman?" Clara thought about it honestly. "I'm out of options," she said. "That's not quite the same thing." "Isn't it? Desperate women take whatever's offered and are grateful. I negotiated." Clara reached for her receipt. "He's given me 6 months to decide if I want to stay. I've kept copies of all his letters. I've told 3 people where I'm going and given them his address." She held Mrs. Fenton's gaze. "I'm not reckless. I'm strategic." Mrs. Fenton looked at her for a long moment. Then something in her face softened, just slightly, the way certain hard things soften when they recognize something they respect. "Good luck, Miss Whitman," she said. "Thank you, Mrs. Fenton." The morning she left, Ruth walked her to the station. They stood on the platform, with Clara's trunk between them and the westbound train steaming on the track, and Ruth, who had not cried when her own mother died, because she said there was no point, was very visibly not crying now in the same determined way. "Write me," Ruth said again. "I will. And if he's terrible, then I leave," Clara said. "He told me I could. Men say things. He put it in writing." Clara picked up her traveling bag. "That's better than most women get." Ruth laughed sharp and quick, the way she laughed when something struck her as both funny and awful. "That's the saddest true thing I've ever heard." "Maybe," Clara said. "Or maybe it's the beginning of something." The conductor called for boarding. Clara hugged Ruth hard and fast, the way you hug someone when the train is leaving, and there's no time for everything you mean to say. She climbed the steps without looking back. She found her seat. She pressed her forehead against the window and watched the platform slide away, and Ruth's face in the crowd, and then the station, and then Boston itself, contracting through the glass, becoming smaller, becoming history. She was 23 years old. She had 11 letters from a man she'd never seen, 1 train ticket, and everything she owned in a trunk in the baggage car. She had no way of knowing if she was brave or desperate, or simply out of alternatives, and she thought, looking at the city disappearing behind her, that maybe those 3 things were sometimes the same thing wearing different names. The train gathered speed, the buildings thinned, the streets gave way to yards, gave way to fields, and Clara Whitman, who had grown up with her nose in books and her heart full of possibilities, her era kept refusing her, turned away from the window and looked at what was ahead. She reached into her bag and took out Eli Tanner's last letter. She read the final paragraph one more time. "I won't promise you happiness, Miss Whitman. I think that's something people build or don't, and no one can hand it to them. But I'll promise you honesty, a fair share of whatever this place produces, and the freedom to make your own choice when you've seen the full picture. That's everything I have to offer. I hope it's enough." She folded the letter carefully and put it back. She thought, "We'll see, Mr. Tanner. We'll see." Outside the window, New England surrendered its grip mile by mile, and the sky opened up in a way Clara had never quite seen, from inside a city vast and uncontainable and absolutely indifferent to what any single person wanted or feared. She did not find it frightening. She found it, after a long moment, something very close to a relief. The train would take 3 days and 2 nights to reach Chicago, where she would change lines and head northwest into territory that no map she'd ever studied had made feel real. She had her ticket. A small bag of provisions Ruth had pressed into her hands at the last moment. Don't argue, just take it, and the practical, unromantic understanding that she was not traveling toward a love story. She was traveling toward a life. And there was a difference. She intended to know what that difference meant by the time she arrived. She pulled out her notebook, the small brown one she'd kept since college, full of observations and calculations, and the occasional furious marginal note, and she opened it to a fresh page. At the top she wrote, "Things I know about Eli Tanner." Then she wrote everything. His ranch was called the Double Creek. He ran cattle primarily with some horses. He had a hand named Dolan, who had been with him 6 years and whom he appeared to trust. He had been married before to a woman named Josephine, who had come from Ohio and left after 2 years, and when Clara had asked him directly what had happened, he had written back, "She wanted things that Montana couldn't give her, and I didn't understand that until it was too late to fix. I should have asked her more questions before she came. I'm asking you more questions." He had asked her more questions. What did she know how to cook? Had she ever ridden a horse? What did she do when she was frightened? What did she believe in, if anything? Could she tolerate silence? She had answered everyone honestly. Some of the answers had not been flattering. She'd told him she was a mediocre cook, had ridden a horse exactly twice and had not enjoyed it, that when she was frightened, she went very quiet and very organized, that she believed in work and reason, and very occasionally God, and that she could tolerate silence better than most people she knew. He had written back, "Good. There's a lot of silence here." She looked at her list. It was thorough and practical, and told her a great deal about a man's circumstances and almost nothing about what it would feel like to stand in front of him. That she supposed was something no amount of letters could prepare her for. She closed the notebook. She looked out at the countryside unrolling past her farmland, now flat and open, nothing like Boston's crowded streets, and she let herself sit with the feeling she'd been holding carefully at arm's length since she bought her last tea at the boarding house. Fear. Plain and honest and hers. She was afraid. She acknowledged it fully the way she'd learned to acknowledge difficult things without flinching, without dramatizing, with the simple factual recognition that this was true, and that being true did not make it permanent. She was afraid. She was also on the train. Both things were equally real. She exhaled slowly. She folded her hands in her lap. She thought about her mother's voice. "You drink it like it matters even when nothing else does." All right, Clara thought. All right. She was 23 years old, and she had chosen this, and whatever came next, it was going to be hers. The first night on the train, Clara did not sleep. She sat upright in her seat, while the car rocked and swayed through the dark, and she listened to the breathing of strangers around her. A merchant who snored with remarkable dedication. A young mother whose infant had finally surrendered to exhaustion, and she kept her traveling bag on her lap with both hands wrapped around it, the way you hold something you cannot afford to lose. She wasn't afraid of the dark. She wasn't afraid of strangers. What kept her awake was something she couldn't name precisely. A kind of hyper-alertness, as though her body understood before her mind did that she had crossed a line she couldn't uncross and was still adjusting to the weight of that fact. She'd made her choice. She was on the train. There was nothing to do now but go forward. That was either comforting or terrifying, and somewhere around 3 in the morning, she decided it was both. By the time dawn came through the windows, she had reorganized everything in her traveling bag, twice, reviewed Eli's letters once more, and calculated to the penny how much money she had left, and how many days it would last if Montana turned out to be a catastrophe. The number was not encouraging. 22 days. She could survive 22 days on what she had if she was careful. After that, she would have to rely on Eli Tanner or find work, and finding work in Montana as a woman with a Boston education and no practical skills was not a prospect she let herself think about for too long. She folded that particular worry back up and put it away. There was no point carrying things she couldn't use yet. The woman in the seat across the aisle woke up around sunrise and immediately looked at Clara with the direct, appraising look of someone who had been observing her for a while and had come to some conclusions. "You're heading west alone," the woman said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Clara said. "Mail order." Clara looked at her. The woman was somewhere in her 40s, broad-shouldered with the kind of permanent tiredness in her face that comes from years of physical work. She wore a plain wool dress and carried a carpet bag that had been repaired at the handle more than once. "Is it that obvious?" Clara asked. "The way you're holding that bag," the woman said, "like it's got everything in it you trust." She paused. "Mine looked the same way 12 years ago." Clara went still. "You were Margaret Hale." The woman didn't extend her hand, just said her name like it was information. "I went to Kansas. Man named Albert Hale. We were married 17 years. She said we're with a flatness that didn't invite follow-up questions about what came after. "I'm Clara Whitman," Clara said. "Montana." "Yes." Margaret nodded slowly the way people nod when they're not surprised. "What do you know about him?" "Quite a bit," Clara said. "We corresponded for 6 weeks. He was very forthcoming." "They're always forthcoming in letters," Margaret said. Not unkindly, just directly. Clara felt the truth of that land, somewhere uncomfortable. "I know," she said. "I've thought about that. And I've decided that the letters were either genuine or they were the most elaborate performance I've ever encountered, and if it's the latter, he deserves some kind of prize." She held Margaret's gaze. "I've also negotiated terms. 6 months, no obligation, my choice at the end." Margaret studied her for a long moment. "He agreed to that in writing. He proposed it." Something shifted in Margaret's expression. Not quite surprise, more like a recalculation. "He proposed it," she repeated. "He said he didn't want a prisoner." Clara watched the woman's face, which I thought was either a very good sign or a very sophisticated manipulation, and I decided the only way to find out was to go. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Albert never said anything like that." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. I made my choice too." She turned to look out the window, and Clara had the sense that the conversation was nearly finished. Then Margaret spoke again without turning back. "What's his name? Eli Tanner." Something crossed Margaret's face, quick and complicated, gone before Clara could read it properly. "Tanner," she said as though she was checking the word against something. "You know him?" Clara asked sharply. "No." Margaret turned back. "I knew a Tanner family in Oklahoma years back. Different man." She paused. "I'm sure it's a different man." She said it with a firmness that Clara might have believed if it hadn't come half a second too late. "Mrs. Hale," Clara said carefully, "if you know something—" "I told you I don't." Margaret picked up her carpet bag and resettled it in her lap. "I just know that men are different in person than they are in paper, and you should be ready for that." She met Clara's eyes one last time. "Whatever he wrote to you, and it sounds like he wrote good things, keep your eyes open when you get there. The letters tell you what he thinks of himself. The first hour tells you what he actually is." Then she settled back and closed her eyes, and that was the end of it. Clara sat with that for a very long time. The first hour tells you what he actually is. She added it to the list in her notebook without deciding what to do with it yet. Chicago came and went in a blur of noise and crowds and the controlled chaos of transferring between rail lines. Clara managed her trunk, her bag, and her bearings with the focused efficiency of someone who cannot afford to lose any of them, and she found the right platform with 12 minutes to spare, which she spent standing very still in the middle of the crowd and breathing slowly. A man bumped into her hard from the left, and her bag swung wide, and her hand clenched around the strap in pure reflex, and she spun to find a boy, 15 maybe, with quick eyes and quicker hands already melting back into the crowd. She looked down at her bag. The clasp was open. She checked inside. Her money was still there, tucked in the inner pocket where she'd moved it 2 days ago, precisely because of places like this. She had read enough newspaper accounts of Chicago's train stations to know that the money in the obvious pocket was always decoy money. She refastened the clasp with hands that were completely steady, and only when she was on the new train, seated bag secured to her wrist, with the belt she'd fashioned from a strip of fabric before leaving Boston, did she allow herself to feel the jolt of what had almost happened. Almost. She'd been prepared. She was fine. She pressed her back against the seat and let out a long, quiet breath. 22 days, she thought. I still have 22 days. Baki. The landscape changed after Chicago in a way that went beyond geography. It wasn't just that the terrain shifted from thick forest to open plain. It was that the sky changed. It got bigger. Clara, who had spent her entire life in a city where sky was something you glimpsed between buildings, found herself pressing close to the window and staring at the horizon with something approaching disorientation. There was so much of it, so much empty space between one thing and the next. She understood intellectually that Montana was vast. She had read about it, measured it on maps, but maps didn't convey the particular feeling of watching distance accumulate and accumulate and accumulate until the edges of the known world simply disappeared. She thought about Eli's letter. There's a lot of silence here. She was beginning to understand what he meant. There was a minister on the second train, a man of about 60, named Reverend Cook, who sat 2 rows ahead of her and who seemed to have taken it upon himself to talk to everyone in the car before they reached their destinations. He got to Clara somewhere in the second afternoon, settling into the empty seat across from her, with the comfortable authority of a man who assumes he is welcome. "Traveling alone?" he asked. "Yes," she said, because she'd stopped pretending otherwise. "Brave young woman." He smiled the smile of a man who means the compliment, but also means the gentle warning folded inside it. "Destination? Stillwater, Montana." "Ah," he nodded slowly. "Cattle country. You have family there?" Clara considered how to answer and decided on honesty, which had been working better than alternatives so far. "I'm to be married," she said, "to a rancher, a Mr. Eli Tanner." The Reverend's expression didn't change dramatically, but something in it shifted a small, almost imperceptible adjustment, like a man rearranging his face around a thought he hadn't expected to have. "You know him," Clara said. It was the second time she'd said those words to a stranger on this train, and the recognition of that pattern made her stomach tighten. "I know of him," Reverend Cook said carefully. "I passed through Stillwater some years ago. Small towns, everyone knows something of everyone." "What do you know?" she asked, directly the way she'd asked everything important in the past 2 months. He was quiet for a moment, and in that moment, Clara felt the fear she'd been managing so carefully do something sharp and sudden in her chest. "His wife died," the Reverend said finally. 2 years ago, thereabouts." "I knew that," Clara said. "He told me. He said she left." "She left," Reverend Cook said. "Yes, and then she died some months later, in Ohio, I believe. She'd gone back to her family." He paused. "I don't know the details, only what comes with rumors in small towns." He looked at her steadily. "What I know of Eli Tanner specifically is that he is considered a fair man by those who've dealt with him, that his ranch is solvent, that he does not drink to excess or gamble, that he is—" He seemed to search for the right word. "Contained, private, difficult to know." "Those aren't the worst things in the world," Clara said. "No," he agreed. "They're not." He looked at her with an expression that was genuinely kind and also deeply serious. "I just want to be certain you go into this with your eyes open." "I've been hearing that a lot," Clara said. "On this train." Something in his face registered that. "Have you?" "Yes." She looked at him evenly, which makes me wonder what people aren't saying directly. He studied her for a long moment. "His wife was unhappy there," he said finally. "From what I understand, she wrote home about it. The isolation, the winters, the—" He paused again, the distance between them, not the physical distance, the other kind. Clara sat with that. He told me he didn't understand what she needed until it was too late, she said. He told me he asked me more questions specifically because of what happened with her. Reverend Cook looked at her with something that might have been relief. He told you about Josephine. He told me what he could. Then he's learned something. The Reverend stood, and the look on his face was complicated and genuine. I hope it's enough, Miss Whitman. Clara Whitman. Miss Whitman? He nodded. You seem like a woman who knows her own mind. I'm still finding out, she said honestly. He smiled at that. A real smile, the rehearsed kindliness gone out of it. That's the most sensible thing anyone has said to me in 3 days of train travel. He tipped his hat. God go with you. She watched him walk back toward his seat and felt the weight of the conversation settle over her like a second coat. The distance between them, not the physical distance, the other kind. She thought about Eli's letters. His precision, his economy of words, the way he answered her questions completely, but rarely offered more than she'd asked for. She had read that as honesty. She still believed it was honesty. But she added a new question to her notebook. What does he not say blank? The last stretch of the journey was the hardest. Not because of any single dramatic event, nothing happened which was almost the problem. The train slowed as the tracks gave way to less traveled lines, and the cars grew emptier as passengers reached their destinations and filed off at stations she'd never heard of. And by the time Stillwater came up on the conductor's route sheet, Clara was nearly alone in her car. She had not slept properly in 3 days. She had eaten what Ruth had packed for her and supplemented it with what she could buy from the train's food car, which was not much. She had read Eli's letters 4 more times and written 3 separate versions of what she might say when she met him and thrown all 3 away. She had practiced being calm and practical and unsentimental, which were the things she needed to be, and she had talked herself out of fear at least twice per hour, like a woman who has very specific experience talking herself out of things. And then the conductor said, Stillwater next stop 15 minutes. And every single one of those preparations fell completely apart. Her heart was going too fast. Her hands were cold. She pressed them flat against her thighs and told herself firmly that this was adrenaline, which was a physical process which had a beginning and an end, and it would pass. It did not pass. She got up anyway. She made her way to the baggage car and identified her trunk and confirmed it would be unloaded. She straightened her best dress, which she'd changed into an hour ago, in the tiny washroom at the end of the car, because she had decided that she wanted to meet Eli Tanner, looking like herself, at her most presentable, not because she was trying to impress him, but because she was trying to respect the gravity of the moment. She stood at the door of the car as the train slowed. She thought about everything she knew about him. His letters, the Reverend's words, Margaret Hale's careful face, the ranch called Double Creek, the hand named Dolan who'd been with him 6 years, his preference for directness, his acknowledgement of failure, his promise I won't hold you to anything until you choose freely. She thought about what she didn't know, which was everything that mattered, and couldn't be written in letters, the sound of his voice, the way he moved. Whether his honesty would hold in person or dissolve into something else entirely. Whether she would be able to live in that much silence. Whether 2 people who had only ever been paper to each other could find something real in the space between letters. The train stopped. Clara Whitman picked up her traveling bag. She walked down the steps onto the platform. The air hit her immediately cold and sharp, and unlike any air she had breathed in her life, carrying in it the smell of open land and pine and something else she couldn't name yet. She looked up. She searched the platform. He was standing at the far end apart from the small cluster of people who'd come to meet the train. He was tall, broader through the shoulders than she'd imagined, from his handwriting, which was a strange thing to have imagined, but she'd imagined it anyway. He wore a plain coat, no hat, his dark hair cut short and a little rough. He wasn't watching the train. He was watching the people coming off it, scanning each face in turn, quietly methodical the way a man looks when he has learned not to assume anything until he sees it with his own eyes. His gaze found her. He went very still. She crossed the platform toward him 12 feet, 8 feet 6, and with every step she was measuring herself against her own fear and finding that she was not unafraid. She was not unafraid. But she was walking anyway, because that was all she'd ever been able to do when the ground shifted under her. Keep moving. Keep looking forward. Keep her hand steady and her chin level. She stopped 2 feet from him. She looked at him directly, the way she'd looked at every hard thing in the past 2 months. He looked at her the same way. "Mr. Tanner," she said. "Miss Whitman," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected. Even. Contained exactly the word the Reverend had used, like someone who had learned long ago to hold things carefully before letting them out. A silence opened between them. Not comfortable, not uncomfortable, just real two people who had said everything in letters, now standing in the actual space between them, and finding that the space was considerably more complicated than paper had made it seem. She was the one who spoke first because she had always been the one to speak first when silence needed breaking. "You're not what I expected," she said. Something moved in his expression. Not offense, something more careful. "What did you expect?" "I'm not sure," she said honestly. "Something that matched the letters more exactly, I suppose. They were very specific." "So were yours," he said. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. More like the recognition of something almost funny in a situation that was mostly not. "You told me you were a mediocre cook." "I am," she said. "That was a relief," he said. "My last cook lied about it, and it cost me 6 months of bad meals." She stared at him. Then despite everything, despite 3 days of bad sleep and cold hands, and Margaret Hale's careful face, and a reverend's careful words, and the weight of every decision she'd made in the past 2 months, she laughed. Short and genuine and completely unexpected, and she watched his face when she did. And what she saw there was something she hadn't been prepared for. He looked startled, as though he hadn't expected it either. As though laughter in this particular spot was something that caught him off guard, and the catching off guard was not unwelcome. "Well," she said when she had herself back, "I suppose that's a start." "I suppose it is," he said. He reached down and picked up her trunk easily, one hand without making any performance of it, and he turned toward the wagon waiting at the edge of the platform, and he said without looking back, "The ranch is an hour's ride. We should go before the light changes." She followed him. She was tired, and her hands were still cold, and she had 100 questions she hadn't asked yet, and Margaret Hale's words were running under everything, like a river she couldn't see. But she was here. She had made it. And the man walking ahead of her was real and solid and complicated, and nothing at all like a letter, which was exactly what she'd known he would be, and somehow hadn't been prepared for anyway. The distance between them, the physical distance, 3 feet of frozen Montana air, felt like the smallest gap she had to cross. It was the other kind she was thinking about as she climbed up beside him and the wagon pulled forward, and Stillwater disappeared behind them into the dark. The ranch came at her out of the dark, the way most true things do, without warning and without the courtesy of being what she'd pictured. She had built a version of it in her mind during the train ride. Something functional and spare, but basically ordered the way Eli's letters were ordered. She had not prepared herself for the particular feeling of arriving somewhere completely new in the dark, when you can't see the edges of things, and your mind can't organize what it's receiving fast enough to feel safe. Eli pulled the wagon to a stop. She heard him jump down, heard his boots hit the frozen ground, and then he was at her side of the wagon, without her having to ask, not offering his hand exactly, but positioning himself in a way that made the step down easy. She took it without comment. That was the right instinct, she thought, offering, without making a ceremony of it. She filed that away. "The house is there," he said. "Dolan sleeps in the bunkhouse east side. You'll have the main bedroom. I'll take the room off the kitchen." She almost said you don't have to do that, but stopped herself in time. He wasn't doing it out of false courtesy. He was doing it because he'd said he would not make her uncomfortable before she chose, and this was what that looked like in practice. She respected it. "Thank you," she said instead. He carried her trunk in without asking. She followed with her traveling bag, and stood in the main room while he lit the lamp, and the light came up slow and amber, and showed her the space she was going to have to make into something livable. It was clean. That was the first thing she noticed, and it mattered more than she'd expected. Whatever Eli Tanner was, he was not slovenly. The floors had been swept. The table was bare but scrubbed. There was wood stacked by the fireplace already laid for a fire. The second thing she noticed was the shelf above the fireplace. Books, more than a dozen of them, spines worn with use. She hadn't known that about him. He hadn't mentioned it. "You read," she said. He glanced at the shelf and back at her. "Winters are long," he said. "You have to do something. You didn't put that in the letters. You didn't ask." She looked at him for a moment. "Fair," she said. He showed her where things were kept. The kitchen stores, the water barrel, the extra blankets with the same economy he brought to everything. The kind of tour that communicated, "Here is what you need to know," without veering into, "Here is what I want you to think of this place." When he finished, he stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her with an expression she was already learning to read, which was the expression of a man waiting to see what she would do with information rather than telling her what she should do with it. "Any questions?" he said. "About 100, she said. "But they can wait until morning." Something in his face registered that. Approval, maybe, or at least its functional equivalent. "I'll have coffee on before 6, he said. "Ranch starts early." "I know," she said. "You mentioned it, twice." "Just making sure it wasn't theoretical," he said. She almost smiled. "Nothing about this is theoretical, Mr. Tanner." He nodded once, turned to go, and then stopped in the doorway. Without turning around, he said, "You can call me Eli. Mr. Tanner was my father, and we didn't get along." He was gone before she could answer. She stood in the kitchen alone for a long moment, listening to the silence he'd told her about, and finding that it was exactly as large as he'd said, and almost nothing like what she'd imagined. Dolan arrived for breakfast the next morning like a weather event suddenly, with a lot of energy and no preamble. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, with the kind of face that spent too much time outdoors to remember what shelter felt like, and he came through the kitchen door saying something to Eli about the north fence, before he registered that Clara was standing at the stove, and stopped dead. "Well," he said, "this is Miss Whitman," Eli said without looking up from the table where he was reading something. "I can see that," Dolan said. He looked at Clara with an expression that was not unfriendly, but was comprehensively evaluating. "You made it then." "I made it," Clara confirmed. "You're shorter than I expected," he said. "You're louder," she said. Dolan blinked. Then he laughed a short, surprised bark of sound, and looked at Eli, who had not looked up from whatever he was reading. "I like her," Dolan said to the room in general. "You've known her 30 seconds, Eli said. "Best 30 seconds of the month," Dolan said cheerfully, and sat down at the table and helped himself to the coffee Clara had made, which she had made very carefully because she was a mediocre cook, but she could at minimum produce coffee that didn't taste like regret. He took a sip. His eyebrows went up. "That's good coffee," he said with what sounded like genuine relief. "Were you expecting otherwise?" Clara asked. He and Eli exchanged a look that communicated something she wasn't privy to yet. "The last housekeeper," Dolan said carefully, "had some strong opinions about coffee that did not match most people's experience of what coffee should be." "How long ago was that?" Clara asked. 3 years, Eli said quietly. The table went still for just a moment. Then Dolan reached for the bread Clara had sliced, and the moment passed, and they ate breakfast in the kind of silence that isn't empty, but isn't ready to be filled yet, either. By the end of the second day, Clara had cooked 3 meals, retrieved 2 broken eggs from a situation involving a bucket and her own inexperience, and discovered that her hands, which had always been her most reliable tools, were completely wrong for half the tasks a ranch required. She burned the soup. Not disastrously, the pot didn't catch fire, which she counted as a win, but badly enough that Dolan ate his portion, with the diplomatic expression of a man being very careful about his face. "It's fine," he said. "It isn't," she said. "It's edible," he offered. "Dolan," she said, "if you tell me it's fine when it isn't, I will make the same mistakes tomorrow." So I need you to tell me what's wrong with it." He looked at Eli. Eli looked at his bowl with the careful neutrality of a man staying out of something. "It's too salty," Dolan said, "and the carrots aren't done." "Thank you," Clara said. "I'll fix it tomorrow." She did fix it. The next day's soup was significantly better, and Dolan said so with the open relief of a man who had been genuinely worried, and Eli ate his whole portion and said nothing, which she was beginning to understand was his version of a compliment. But on the third morning, she made a different kind of mistake. She was looking for the spare pot in the back of the kitchen cupboard, and she found it behind a box she had to move, and inside the box she didn't mean to look, but the lid wasn't fastened, and it shifted when she moved. It were things that were clearly not Eli's. A woman's things. A hairbrush. A pair of light gloves, the kind women wore in spring. A small Bible with a name written inside the front cover in a careful rounded hand, Josephine Ann Tanner. Clara set the lid back on the box and put it back exactly where she'd found it, and got the pot and closed the cupboard and stood very still in the kitchen for a moment. She hadn't asked him to remove Josephine's things. She hadn't expected him to. She told herself it was reasonable he was a widower. It had been 2 years people kept things. It meant nothing. She also told herself that a woman's belongings packed in a box in the back of a cupboard was a specific kind of keeping, and it meant something she just didn't know what. She went back to the stove and finished what she was doing and didn't say anything about it. Eli found her trying to manage one of the horses 4 days in. Not the complicated ones she'd specifically asked Dolan which animal was the most tolerant of human incompetence, and he'd pointed her to a broad brown mare named Pearl, who had, according to Dolan, the patience of a woman who had given up being surprised by anything. She had been attempting to get Pearl to accept a lead rope for 20 minutes. Pearl was not being difficult exactly. She was simply being indifferent in a way that was worse than difficult, because it gave Clara nothing to push against. "You're asking her," Eli said from somewhere behind her. She didn't startle. She was tired enough that she'd used up her capacity for surprise. "I beg your pardon. The way you're holding the rope." He came up beside her. He didn't touch anything, just stood there. "You're holding it like a question. She can feel that." Clara looked at the rope in her hand, and then at Pearl, who was looking at her with the monumental patience of a creature that had been alive long enough to find humans mostly interchangeable. "How do I hold it like an answer?" Clara asked. "Like you've already decided," he said. "Not hard. Just decided." She adjusted her grip. She thought about boarding the train in Boston. She thought about the moment she mailed the first letter. She thought about the decisions she'd made that were terrifying and non-negotiable, and done. She held the rope like a decision. Pearl lowered her head and let the rope go on without complaint. "Huh," Clara said softly. "Animals know," Eli said. He was already turning to go. "People sometimes do too if you give them a chance." She almost let it go. Then she said, "Is that what you did with me in the letters?" Held the rope like a decision. He stopped. He didn't turn around immediately. When he did, his expression was the careful one she'd been cataloging, the face he wore when he was thinking something honest that he hadn't decided to say yet. "No," he said. "With you, I was genuinely asking. I wasn't sure you'd come." A pause. "I wasn't sure I wanted you to." She stared at him. "You sent the ticket." "I sent the ticket," he said. "And I spent 2 weeks after that wondering if I'd made a mistake." The honesty of it hit her squarely. This was what the Reverend had meant by contained, not cold, not dishonest, but someone who kept things compressed until the pressure became too much to pretend wasn't there. "And now," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "Now I don't know yet," he said. "But that's different from wondering if it was a mistake." She turned back to Pearl. She heard him walk away, and she stood there with the lead rope in her hands, and the cold air around her, and the particular feeling of having been told something true that she didn't yet have enough information to understand. She filed it. She kept going. "Nah, The neighbor came on a Thursday afternoon, arriving in a buckboard without announcement, the way people in open country apparently felt entitled to do. Her name was Helen Marsh, and she was somewhere between 50 and 60, the wife of the rancher on the property adjacent to Eli's, and she brought a pie and a manner that suggested she had been wanting to come since the moment word got out that Eli Tanner had sent for a woman. Clara was in the kitchen when Helen knocked, or rather, when Helen opened the door and knocked at the same time, which told Clara something about the woman's relationship to other people's houses. "You must be Clara," Helen said, looking at her with an avidity that Clara recognized as curiosity, dressed up as friendliness. "I'm Helen Marsh. I've been meaning to come all week." "Please sit down," Clara said. "I'll make coffee." Helen sat. She put the pie on the table and folded her hands and watched Clara at the stove with the particular attention of a woman who is forming opinions faster than she's letting on. "He treating you well?" Helen asked. "Yes," Clara said. "He working you hard?" "It's a working ranch," Clara said. "I expected work." Helen was quiet for a moment. "You knew what you were coming to then?" He was very clear in the letters. Helen made a sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite contradiction. Clara set the coffee on the table and sat down across from her and waited. "Josephine wasn't," Helen said finally. There it was. Clara kept her face neutral. "He told me," she said, "that she wasn't prepared for it." "He told you that?" Helen's voice had something in it. "He tell you the rest?" Clara went very still. "What rest?" Helen looked at her with the expression of a woman who has been holding something for a long time and has just decided to put it down. "Josephine wrote to me," she said, "before she left after she left. We'd gotten close the 2 years she was here." She paused. She wasn't just unprepared for the work. She was lonely, Clara. Bone-deep lonely. She said she'd talked to Eli for an hour and come away feeling like she'd talked to a wall. Not a cruel wall. A very decent, very honest, very contained, Clara said quietly. Helen blinked. "Yes, exactly that." She studied her. "He used that word." "Someone else did," Clara said. "About him." Helen wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "She left because she couldn't reach him. 2 years and she couldn't find a way through. She told me the last month before she went, she said it wasn't that he didn't care. She thought he did care. She just couldn't feel it because he kept everything so far inside that she couldn't find it." Helen's voice was careful and honest the way Clara's voice was when she was saying something that cost her. "She died in Ohio 6 months later. Fever. It had nothing to do with him. But he took it that way. He took it like it was his fault, and he's been carrying that ever since." The kitchen was very quiet. "Why are you telling me this?" Clara asked. "Because you're not Josephine," Helen said. "I can see that in 5 minutes. You're harder in the good way, more direct. You ask questions instead of waiting to be told." She met Clara's eyes. "But hard doesn't fix what's broken in a man if he doesn't know it's broken, and you need to know what you're working with." Clara sat with that. She thought about the box in the back of the kitchen cupboard. She thought about, "I was genuinely asking. I wasn't sure I wanted you to come." She thought about the way he'd said she wanted things Montana couldn't give her, the way he'd accepted the blame so completely folded it into himself and carried it forward, never asking whether the blame was fully his to carry. She thought about what it cost a person to do that year after year. "Thank you," she said to Helen. She meant it. Helen nodded. She cut the pie and served them both and stayed another hour, and by the time she left, Clara had the beginning of an understanding that hadn't been possible from letters. You couldn't know this from paper. You couldn't know any of it from paper. The only way to know it was to be here in the kitchen drinking coffee with the woman who'd watched the last marriage fail and was quietly, carefully watching to see if this one had better odds. That evening, after supper, Clara found Eli on the porch. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at him and thought about Josephine's handwriting inside the Bible. Thought about Helen's voice. She couldn't reach him. thought about the distance between them. Not the physical distance. She stepped outside. The cold hit her, and she pulled her shawl tighter, and she stood beside him and didn't say anything for a moment, because she was thinking about how to say what she needed to say without making it something it wasn't yet. "Helen Marsh came by today," she said. "I know," he said. "I saw the buckboard. She told me about Josephine." He went very still. Not tense, just still the way things go, still before they're forced to decide whether to move. "What did she tell you?" he said. His voice was even. She couldn't tell what was underneath it. "That Josephine was lonely," Clara said. "That she couldn't reach you. That you keep everything so far inside that a person can stand right next to you and still not know what you're thinking or whether you care." He didn't answer. The silence stretched out, and it had a different quality than the other silences she'd sat inside this week. Not comfortable, not companionable, but pressurized. "Is that true?" she said. "Probably," he said after a moment. Just that one word. Clara looked at him. "Eli," she said, and it was the first time she'd used his name, and she felt him register it. "I'm not Josephine. I'm not going to wait 2 years and then leave without telling you what's wrong. That's not how I work." She paused. "But I need you to understand something. I came here to build a life, not to guess my way through one. If you can't tell me things, tell me that. If there are things you're not ready to say you're not ready. But don't make me feel like I'm talking to a wall." He turned to look at her then, and the expression on his face was something she hadn't seen there yet. It wasn't the careful blankness or the precise honesty of the letters. It was something that looked, if she had to name it, like a man seeing himself from the outside for the first time in a while and not being entirely comfortable with the view. "I didn't know she felt like that," he said, "until she was gone." "I know," Clara said. "She didn't tell you. I'm telling you." He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she thought the conversation might be over. Then he said, without looking away from whatever he was looking at out in the dark, "I'm not good at this part. The talking. He stopped and started again. "On the ranch I know exactly what I'm doing and why. Out here with—" He gestured vaguely between them. "I don't always know what's required." "What's required is just honesty," she said. "You've been doing that. I just need more of it." He looked at her again. That same look, the one that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the same territory. "More honesty," he said. "You're the first person who's ever asked me for more of that." "Then you've been spending time with the wrong people," she said. And something happened in his face then that she watched with the same careful attention she'd been giving everything since she arrived. Something shifted. Something that had been very tightly held relaxed just slightly, just at the edges, like a fist uncurling one finger at a time. It wasn't a breakthrough. It wasn't a resolution. It was the beginning of a crack in something that had been sealed shut for a long time, and it was just enough to let the light in. She went back inside. She stood in the kitchen and held onto the back of a chair for a moment and breathed. She hadn't come here for love. She'd come here for a life. But standing in that kitchen with the cold air still on her skin and the sound of Eli still on the porch and the particular weight of a man beginning slowly to let someone in, she thought that maybe those two things didn't have to be as far apart as she'd believed. Maybe the distance could be crossed. She just had to be patient enough and honest enough and stubborn enough to cross it. She thought, always been all three. 2 weeks into her time at Double Creek, Clara learned that Eli Tanner spoke most honestly when he thought he wasn't saying anything important. It came out in small things. The way he'd mention over coffee that the north pasture had the best grass in the county, but the creek that fed it ran thin every August, so you had to plan for it or lose cattle you couldn't afford to lose. The way he'd describe a problem with the fence line, and then, almost as an aside, tell her what he'd done wrong the first time he fixed it, and what he'd done differently the second time. He never framed these things as confessions or lessons. He just said them the way you say things you've stopped being precious about, and Clara collected them all. She was building a map of him. Not consciously, not strategically the way you build a map of any place you're genuinely trying to learn, because you understand that survival depends on knowing the terrain. Dolan noticed. Of course Dolan noticed. Dolan noticed everything and had opinions about all of it, which he shared freely with Clara whenever Eli was out of earshot. "You know what you're doing," Dolan said one morning, watching her from across the kitchen table while she went through the household accounts Eli had handed her with the same brisk practicality he brought to everything. "You're better with numbers than I am," Helen said. "So here's the ledger." "I'm trying to," Clara said without looking up. "No, I mean with him." Dolan wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "Nobody's ever just listened to him like that. Most people either take him at face value or they give up when he doesn't open fast enough." "He opens," Clara said. "You just have to be patient about which door." Dolan looked at her for a long moment. "Josephine wasn't patient," he said. "It wasn't a criticism, just a fact." "I know," she said. "I'm not Josephine." "No," Dolan said. "You're really not." He said it like he was still adjusting to what that meant. Clara turned a page in the ledger and stopped. She looked at the numbers again. Then she went back 3 pages and looked at those numbers. Then she set the ledger down flat on the table and pressed both palms against it and said very carefully, "Dolan." "Yeah." "How long has the ranch been carrying this much debt?" The silence that followed told her everything before he said a word. "Eli didn't tell you," Dolan said. "He gave me the current accounts," she said. "Not the history." She kept her voice level, because losing her composure in front of Dolan would accomplish nothing, and she needed information more than she needed to react. "Talk to me." Dolan set his cup down. "2 bad winters 3 years back. Lost a third of the herd. He borrowed to restock. The lender man named Gerald Price runs the bank in Billings gave him a 5-year note." He paused. "That note comes due in 4 months. Clara looked at the numbers. She'd already been doing the arithmetic before he finished the sentence. "The ranch can't cover it," she said. "Not by itself," Dolan said. "Not without a very good spring sale." He met her eyes. "Which Eli's been counting on. And which is not guaranteed because Price has been—" He stopped. "Has been what?" "Making noise," Dolan said carefully. "About calling it early." "He can't call it early," she said immediately. "Not if the terms don't allow it." Dolan looked at her with the expression of a man who understands the practical world better than the legal one. "Miss Clara." "Show me the note," she said. "I don't have it. Eli does." "Then I need to talk to Eli." She closed the ledger and stood up. "Where is he?" "North fence, probably." She was already getting her coat. She found him where Dolan said she would. He was repairing a section of fence with the focused, contained energy he brought to physical work, and he heard her coming and straightened and read her face before she said anything. "You looked at the ledger," he said. "You knew I would," she said. "That's why you gave it to me." Something flickered in his expression. Not quite guilt. Something more complicated, the look of a man who put something in someone's path and then wasn't sure when they found it, whether he was relieved or exposed. "I need to see the note with Price," she said. "Clara." "Eli." She held his gaze. "You told me in your letters you needed a partner, not a romantic notion. Partners know the full picture, so show me the full picture." He looked at her for a long moment. The cold air moved between them. "The full picture isn't good," he said. "I can see that from the ledger," she said. "I need to know whether it's survivable or whether it's something else." He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. She had not expected him to have it on him, and the fact that he did that, he'd been carrying it around possibly for days, told her something she filed away carefully. She took it, opened it, and read it standing there in the cold, with the wind working at the edges of the paper. She read it twice because the first time her mind moved too fast, and she needed to slow down and be precise. "He's trying to call it early," she said. "He says you're in violation of the maintenance clause." "He says the north pasture fence isn't up to the standard the note requires," Eli said. His voice was flat and controlled. "He had a man come out 2 weeks ago, assessed it." 2 weeks ago. She looked up. "Before I got here." "Yes." "You knew this before you—" She stopped. Recalibrated. Did you send for me because of the money situation? The question landed between them like something thrown hard. He didn't answer immediately. She watched his face, watched the careful, contained man work through something that clearly cost him, and she did not look away or soften the question because she needed the honest answer more than she needed to be comfortable. No, he said finally. I sent for you because I was tired of this place being quiet in a way that had nothing to do with silence. He held her gaze. But I also knew the note was a problem, and I knew I needed someone who could think clearly about it. Someone who wouldn't panic. A beat. You're the first person I've met in 2 years who doesn't seem to panic. She stood with that. That's a lot to carry, she said quietly. Alone. I know, he said, just that. She folded the note. She put it in her own coat pocket. I'm going to write to Price, she said. He can't legally call this note early. The maintenance clause requires written notice and 30 days to cure. Has he given you written notice? He sent a letter. When? 3 weeks ago. Then you have a week left on the cure period. Is the fence repaired? Eli looked at her steadily. I've been repairing it. Good. She turned to go back toward the house. Don't do anything else with Price until I've written the letter. Don't send anyone to him. Don't respond to anything he sends. Don't. Clara. His voice stopped her. She turned. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't catalogued yet. Something that wasn't careful and wasn't contained, and was, she thought, probably the closest to unguarded she'd seen him. Why are you doing this? She looked at him squarely. Because you said you needed a partner, she said, and this is what that means. She turned and walked back to the house. Behind her she heard him go back to the fence, and the sound of the work starting again, steady and purposeful, and she thought, good. Keep working. I'll handle the rest. Gerald Price arrived at Double Creek 3 days later, which told Clara 2 things simultaneously. He'd received her letter, and he had not enjoyed it. He was a banker's banker, the kind of man whose confidence lives in his title and his account ledgers, and becomes visibly uncomfortable when neither is functioning the way he expects. He arrived in a good coat and bad temper, and he came to the door instead of the main house entrance which Clara had anticipated. She opened the door before he could knock. He looked at her. She looked at him. Mr. Price, she said. I'm Clara Whitman. I wrote the letter. Where's Tanner? He said. Mr. Tanner is working, she said. He's asked me to handle the correspondence on this matter. Please come in. He came in because declining would have required him to articulate why, which he clearly hadn't prepared for. She sat him at the kitchen table with coffee he didn't touch, and the copy of the note she'd made with her annotations alongside it. The maintenance clause, she said, pushing it toward him, requires written notice and 30 days to cure before any acceleration of the debt. You sent your letter 23 days ago. The fence in question is being repaired and will be completed within the cure period. She kept her voice calm and precise. So the early call is not legally valid. Price looked at the paper and then at her with the expression of a man reassessing a situation he'd entered with more certainty than it deserved. Miss Whitman, he said, this is a business matter between me and Tanner. I'm authorized to speak for the ranch, she said. She slid a second document across one she and Eli had signed 2 days ago, which Dolan had witnessed, which gave her authority to act in ranch business matters. She had drafted it herself the same night she'd read the note because she had learned from her father's ledgers what happened to people who waited until they needed documents to get them. Price looked at the authorization. His jaw tightened just slightly. I want to be very clear about something, Clara said. The Double Creek's spring herd is solid. The accounts are current on the principal. The fence will be repaired within the cure period. If you attempt to call this note early after the cure is completed, we will contest it, and the terms of this note are clear enough that we will win. She paused. Which will cost you more in legal fees than it costs us, and will cost you considerably more in reputation, because there are 6 other ranchers in this county who hold notes at your bank and who will be watching how this resolves. The silence that followed had a particular quality, the quality of a man running numbers in his head and finding that they don't add up the way he wanted. "You're very confident for a woman who's been here 3 weeks," Price said. "I'm confident because the document says what it says," Clara replied. "My length of residence has nothing to do with it." He sat with that. Then he picked up his coffee, drank some of it, and set it down. "The note matures in 4 months," he said. "If it's not paid in full—" "We're aware of the maturity date," she said. "The spring sale will cover it. And if it doesn't, then we'll have that conversation in 4 months." She met his eyes. "Based on facts that exist, then not fears that exist now." Price looked at her for a long moment. She'd seen that look before in Boston on the faces of men who had decided a woman was manageable and had then discovered she was something else entirely, and were working through the adjustment in real time. "You're not what I expected," he said. "People keep saying that," she said. He left 40 minutes later without having gained a single thing he'd come for, which was exactly what she'd intended. Eli found her in the kitchen afterward, still sitting at the table with the documents spread in front of her. She was writing notes on the spring sale projections, running calculations, checking Dolan's cattle count against the market prices she'd gotten from the newspaper Eli kept in a stack by the door. He stood in the kitchen and looked at everything she'd laid out on the table. "He's gone," he said. "He's gone," she said. "He'll let the cure period run. He's not foolish enough to fight a document that clearly." She looked up. "The real problem is the maturity date. 4 months. The spring sale has to be strong." "I know," he said. He sat down across from her. He looked at the papers, really looked at them the way a man looks when he's trying to see something through someone else's eyes. "Helen told me you had a head for numbers," he said. "Dolan told me after the first day." "Dolan talks a lot," Clara said. "It's his greatest strength and his most significant flaw." Eli looked at the ledger. "My father kept this ranch for 30 years. He never had a note with Price. I've had it 3. He said it without self-pity, just as fact the way he said most things. "I made bad decisions after Josephine left. I was distracted, in the wrong direction." "You blamed yourself," she said. "I still do," he said. "Some of it. Some of it was yours," she said carefully. "Some of it wasn't." She watched his face. She was also a woman who didn't say what she needed. "That's not entirely your failure." He was quiet for a moment. "That's the first time anyone said that to me," he said. "Is it true?" "Probably," he said. "But it's easier to carry the whole thing than to figure out which part belongs to you and which part doesn't." She looked at him steadily. "That kind of carrying breaks people," she said. "I know." He met her eyes. "I've been breaking some, slowly." He said it with the same flatness he used for everything honest, and she understood that it was not resignation. It was just what the truth sounded like coming out of a man who had not said it before. "Then stop carrying what isn't yours," she said, "and let me help with what is." He didn't answer right away. She let the silence sit. She'd learned that about him, that the silence wasn't absence. It was where he did his actual thinking. "The books," he said finally. "I'm better with cattle than I am with paper." "I can see that from the ledger," she said. Not unkindly, just honestly. Something moved in his expression, almost a smile. "Is that a criticism?" "It's an observation," she said. "You're exceptional with cattle. The herd numbers are good. The grazing rotation is intelligent. The problem isn't how you run the ranch. The problem is the paperwork around the ranch." She pushed the ledger toward him and set her own calculations beside it. "Look, if we sell these 30 head in March, instead of waiting for April, the prices drop in April. It's right there in the last 3 years' records. We cover the note with a margin. Not a large margin, but enough." He looked at the numbers. She watched him track the logic, and she could see the moment it clicked, the way his expression shifted from careful to certain, the way a man looks when he recognizes a correct solution. "March is earlier than I've ever sold," he said. "I know, but the April prices have been soft 3 years running. There's no reason to expect this year to be different." He sat back. He looked at her, not at the papers at her, and for the second time since she'd arrived, she had the sensation of being seen rather than assessed. Not evaluated for competence or convenience. Just seen the way people see each other when they've stopped protecting themselves from the experience of it. "Clara," he said, and the way he said her name, the same way she'd said his on the porch like a door opening, made something shift in her chest. "Why didn't you leave when you found out about the debt?" She looked at him straight. "Because you didn't hide it from me," she said. "You handed me the ledger. Maybe you were hoping I'd find it. Maybe you were just being honest. Either way, you didn't hide it." She paused. "That's more than most men would have done." He was quiet. "And because," she said, "this place is survivable. I've done the math twice. It's hard, and it requires the right decisions in the next 4 months, but it's survivable." She looked at him. "I didn't come here for easy. I came here for real." The kitchen was very quiet. Then he said so quietly she almost missed it. "Josephine hated this room." She didn't answer. She waited. She said it was too small and too dark and it smelled like work. He was looking at the table. "I repainted it after she left. Added the window on the south wall." A beat. "I don't know why I'm telling you that." "Because you're talking," Clara said simply. "And it's all right. You can keep doing it." He looked up. The expression on his face was one she hadn't seen there yet. Something open and slightly bewildered, like a man who has been standing in one room his whole life and just discovered there's a door he hadn't tried. "You're strange," he said. "Not unkind, just true." "In Boston," she said, "that was considered a problem." "Out here," he said with that almost smile, "it's in short supply." She gathered the papers. She organized them into their proper order and stacked them neatly and set them where he could find them. She did it with the same focused economy she brought to everything, because that was how she functioned, not dramatically, not with grand gestures, but thoroughly and without wasted motion. She stood up from the table. She pulled her shawl around her shoulders. "I'll write to the stockyards in Billings tomorrow," she said. "Get the March numbers in writing so Price can't argue them." "All right," he said. She moved toward the door. Then he said, "Clara," and she stopped. "Thank you," he said. Just those 2 words. But he said them the way a man says something he has not said in a very long time, something he wasn't sure he still knew how to say, and the weight of it was entirely disproportionate to its size. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about the train. She thought about the letter she'd mailed into the unknown, and the life she'd decided to gamble on, and the man sitting at the kitchen table who was slowly, painstakingly, one honest sentence at a time, becoming someone she might be glad she'd found. "Don't thank me," she said. "This is what partners do." She went to bed that night with the accounts in good order, and a clarity she hadn't felt since Boston, not the desperate clarity of someone who has no options, but the purposeful clarity of someone who has chosen and committed and is now doing the work that the choice requires. Outside, the Montana dark pressed against the windows the way it always did, vast and indifferent, and absolutely unconcerned with anyone's plans. She had stopped finding it frightening somewhere around the 10th day. Now it just felt like the size of the thing she was building, which was, she thought, exactly right. The morning of the spring sale, Dolan burned the oatmeal. It was the only meal he'd ever attempted to make in Clara's kitchen, and he'd done it because she was already up at 4 in the morning, reviewing the final cattle count and the Billings stockyard confirmation letter for the 3rd time, and he'd thought incorrectly, as it turned out, that making breakfast would help. "You didn't have to do that," she said, scraping the pot. "I know," he said. "I wanted to do something." She looked at him. He was standing in the kitchen with his hat in his hands, turning it in circles the way he did when he had something to say that he wasn't sure how to say. Dolan, who never ran out of words, suddenly didn't know where to put them. "Dolan," she said. "What is it?" "Nothing," he said. Too fast. "Dolan." He stopped turning his hat. "He didn't sleep," he said. "I could hear him moving around until 2 in the morning. He does that when something matters a lot." Clara was quiet for a moment. She turned back to the stove and started fresh oatmeal because there was nothing useful to say to that, and also because they had a full day of cattle sale logistics ahead of them, and someone needed to think about food. "He'll be fine," she said. "The numbers are right. We've checked them 4 times. "It's not the numbers he's up about," Dolan said carefully. She didn't answer that. She knew what Dolan meant. She'd known for about 3 weeks what Dolan meant because she'd been watching Eli the way she watched everything she was trying to understand carefully without forcing it, giving it room to show her what it was. What she'd seen in the last 3 weeks was a man in the middle of becoming something he hadn't been before, and doing it slowly and without any of the language people normally used to describe that process, because Eli Tanner did not use that language, and likely never would. He brought her coffee before she asked for it. He started telling her about the ranch's history, unprompted his father's decisions, his own early mistakes, the seasons that had nearly broken them, and the seasons that had saved them. He asked her questions about Boston, about her father, about what she'd wanted before necessity had narrowed the options down to a train ticket and an advertisement in the paper. He listened the way people listen when they're not waiting for their turn to speak, but actually absorbing what they're given. 3 days ago, he'd come back from the north fence at midday, which was unusual, and he'd stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "I found something I think belonged to your mother." She'd looked at him in confusion, and he'd held out a small pressed flower, dried and fragile, tucked between the pages of a book she'd packed, and that had fallen open on the table. A forget-me-not still faintly blue. Her mother had kept a garden full of them. "I don't know how it got on the table," he said. "I must have left the book open," she said. "The wind—" She stopped. She took the flower very carefully from his hand, and he saw her face do something with it, and he didn't say anything, which was exactly right. She'd pressed it flat into her notebook between 2 pages, and hadn't said anything either. But that night at supper, she'd told him about her mother's garden, and he had listened all the way through without once looking like he wanted to be somewhere else. That was 3 days ago. Tonight, after the sale was settled, her 6 months would be nearly up. She hadn't mentioned it. Neither had he. The cattle drive to the Billings staging area took 3 hours with Eli and Dolan and 2 hired hands she'd never worked with, but who clearly knew what they were doing. Clara rode alongside in the wagon with the paperwork, and for most of those 3 hours, she was doing calculations she already knew the answer to. Because doing calculations she already knew the answer to was how she kept her hands busy when her mind was doing something else. The buyer from Billings was a man named Garrett, compact and efficient, with the particular manner of someone who has spent his life evaluating livestock and has come to apply the same process to everything, including people. He looked at the cattle, looked at Clara, looked at Eli, and made his offer. It was $400 less than the price she'd negotiated in her letter. She felt Eli go still beside her without looking at him. "Mr. Garrett," she said, "our agreed price was in writing." "Prices move," he said. He wasn't apologetic about it. "I have other sellers at better rates this week." "Then you should sell their cattle," she said. "Because we're selling at the written price or we're finding another buyer." She held the letter out. "Would you like to look at what you signed, or should I find someone who reads agreements more carefully?" Garrett looked at her, looked at Eli. Eli said nothing, which Clara had learned was his method of making space. He was giving her the room she'd already demonstrated she could use. "The price stands," Garrett said finally. He said it like it had been his idea. When the paperwork was completed and the money was confirmed and Garrett had walked away, Dolan appeared at Clara's elbow and said at a volume that was louder than strictly necessary, "I have never enjoyed watching someone negotiate as much as I just enjoyed watching you negotiate." "Dolan," Eli said, "I'm just saying." "I know what you're saying. Stop saying it." Dolan stopped, but he was smiling in the uncontainable way of a man who has just seen something he'll be describing to people for years. The ride back was quieter. The light was going golden and long by the time Double Creek came into view, and Clara was running the final numbers one more time, the sale minus Dolan's wages, and the hired hands minus operating costs against the note, and the margin was not large, but it was real. It was enough. They had enough. She said it aloud when they pulled up to the house. "We covered it." She looked at Eli. "The note is done." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll write to Price tomorrow." "I already drafted the letter," she said. "It just needs your signature." He looked at her. That expression again, the one she'd catalogued as something close to unguarded. "Of course you did," he said, not sarcastic, almost tender in the way that was available to him. Dolan made a noise that could have been a cough and excused himself to the bunkhouse with a speed that suggested he knew when he wasn't needed. She was in the bedroom reorganizing her trunk when Eli knocked. She'd pulled everything out to find her mother's recipe book, which she'd thought might be useful for something she was planning to try tomorrow. And the trunk's entire contents were spread across the bed when she heard his knock at the open door. "Clara." His voice was wrong. She turned, and his face was wrong, too tighter than usual, something in it that she hadn't seen before. He was looking at the trunk, at its contents on the bed, at her traveling bag open beside it. She understood in the same second. "I'm looking for my mother's recipe book," she said immediately. He didn't answer right away. He was working through something. She could see it the way you could see a river working through a new channel, all that force trying to find its path. "You're 6 months," he said. His voice was very controlled. "They're up in 4 days." "I know," she said. "I told you." He stopped, started again. "I told you that you could leave, that I wouldn't hold you to anything." He looked at the trunk and then at her. "I meant it. I still mean it." She looked at him. "Are you telling me to leave?" "No." Quick. Certain. The first instant thing she'd ever heard him say. "No, I'm not telling you to leave." "Then what are you doing?" He was quiet. He crossed his arms and uncrossed them and put his hands in his pockets, which was the most physically unresolved she'd ever seen him, and she understood that she was watching something that cost him considerably. "I'm trying," he said slowly, "to tell you something without making it into a condition. Because I don't want it to be a condition." He met her eyes. "I want you to choose because of what you want, not because I've made you feel obligated." She waited. "But I also—" He stopped again. Then he said it. "I would like you to stay, Clara. I would very much like you to stay. Not because of the ranch, not because of the debt or the ledger or the letter writing." He held her gaze, and there was nothing contained about it now, nothing careful, just a man saying a true thing because it had gotten too big to keep inside. "Because this house is different with you in it. Because I sleep at night now in a way I haven't in 2 years. Because when I come in from the fence line and you're at the table doing numbers and arguing with the ledger out loud when you think no one can hear." She laughed before she could stop it. The same surprised, genuine laugh from the train platform, and she watched it do the same thing to him. It had done then catch him off guard in a way that was clearly not unwelcome. "You can hear that," she said. "The walls are not thick," he said. And the almost smile was there, and something else behind it that wasn't almost anything. It was just real and present, and his. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Ruth on the Boston platform holding back tears she refused to let out. She thought about Margaret Hale on the train with her carpet bag repaired at the handle. She thought about Reverend Cook and his careful warnings, and Helen Marsh and her pie and her honesty, and Josephine's name in the front of a small Bible in the back of a cupboard. She thought about 11 letters tied with string, and a train ticket, and a woman who had mailed her future into the unknown because the known had run out. She thought about Pearl the horse and what Eli had said. "Hold it like you've already decided." "I unpacked 3 weeks ago," she said. He went very still. "What?" "The trunk." She gestured at the bed. "This is the first time I've opened it since I got here. I unpacked my things into the dresser and the wardrobe 3 weeks after I arrived." She held his gaze. "I just didn't tell you because I didn't think it was information you needed yet." He stared at her. 3 weeks ago. Almost 4, she said. "I've been here 6 weeks." The silence that followed was the largest one she'd ever sat inside with him, and it had a quality that none of the others had, something that wasn't absence and wasn't pressure. But was she thought the sound of a man's chest opening after a very long time of being closed? "Clara," he said. Her name in his voice, and the way he said it now was different from the first time on the platform, different from the porch, different from the kitchen. It had all of those layers in it and something new underneath. "Eli," she said. Same layers, same something new. He crossed the room in 3 steps, and he took her hand. Just her hand, both of his around it, the way you hold something you've been afraid to hold in case it breaks. And he stood there with her hand in his and said, "I should have asked you properly." "You asked me honestly," she said. "That's better." "I didn't." He stopped, tried again. "I didn't tell you what I was hoping for. In the letters. I told you what I needed. I didn't tell you what I was hoping." "What were you hoping?" she said softly. He looked at her, and the contained, careful, private man she'd been learning for 6 weeks was still there, would always be there. She thought it was who he was. But the door she'd seen crack open on the porch was open now fully, and what was on the other side of it was exactly what she'd suspected. Not absence, not coldness, but something quiet and deep and stubborn and real, the kind of feeling that doesn't perform itself because it's never needed an audience. "This," he said, "exactly this." She turned her hand over inside his and held back. They told Dolan the next morning at breakfast. He looked at them for approximately 4 seconds, then stood up and said, "Finally," with such tremendous relief that Clara actually laughed, and even Eli's expression shifted into something unambiguously warm. "How long have you known?" Clara asked. "Since about week 2, Dolan said, sitting back down and reaching for the bread. "When he started repairing the south porch railing that's been broken for 3 years. He jerked his head at Eli. "He didn't fix it for himself. He's never cared about that railing in his life." Eli said nothing, but he didn't deny it either. Helen Marsh came that afternoon. Word, as always, moved faster than any wagon in Stillwater. And she came with a different kind of pie and a different kind of expression on her face. Something that wasn't the careful, evaluating look she'd brought the first time, but something softer and more private, like a woman who had been carrying a worry for a long time and had just set it down. She hugged Clara before she sat down, which Clara hadn't expected. "I hoped," Helen said against her shoulder. "I really hoped." "I know," Clara said. Helen pulled back and looked at her. "Josephine would have—" She stopped. "I'm sorry. That's not—" "It's all right," Clara said. "You can say it." Helen looked at her. "She would have been glad," she said. She never wanted him to be alone. She just couldn't be the one to fix it. Helen's eyes were bright. "You didn't fix him. That's different. You just gave him somewhere to be." Clara thought about that. She thought about Eli at the fence with the lead rope. Hold it like you've already decided. She thought about the box in the back of the cupboard, and the shelf full of worn books, and the coffee that existed before she asked for it. "He did the same for me," she said. "That's how it's supposed to work." They were married on the last Saturday of March in the small church in Stillwater that Reverend Cook, who, as it happened, had his regular circuit through the county and arrived the week before, as though he'd been expected, conducted with the brisk efficiency of a man who understood that the ceremony mattered less than what it was sealing. Clara wore her best dress, the dark blue one she'd kept for important occasions. Eli wore his good coat and a clean shirt, and the expression of a man who had decided to be exactly where he was and was not apologizing for it. Dolan stood beside Eli. Helen stood beside Clara. The church held maybe 30 people, ranchers and their wives from across the county, a few faces from town people who knew Eli and were now deciding what to make of her. She let them look. She'd been letting people look her whole life and had learned that the ones worth knowing eventually came to their own honest conclusions. Reverend Cook kept the ceremony short, which she appreciated. He asked the standard words, and they gave the standard answers, and then he looked at Eli and said, slightly off script, "Is there anything you'd like to say before God and these witnesses?" Eli looked at Reverend Cook. Then he looked at Clara. The church was very quiet. He said, "I'm going to keep trying to be better at this than I've been. I can't promise you easy or comfortable or any of the things I probably should have figured out how to give someone a long time ago." He held her gaze with the directness that she'd learned was simply who he was. Not performance, not effect, just the unornamented truth. "But I'll tell you what's true, every day, even when it's hard, and I'll listen to what you tell me, and I will not waste you." The last 3 words landed in the church and stayed there. Clara had been managing her composure since she got up that morning with the same deliberate effort she managed everything. She was not a woman who cried easily or publicly, and she had not planned to start today. She looked at this man who had written her honest letters and sent her an honest ticket and built her an honest 6 months and had said, "I will not waste you in front of 30 people in a small Montana church," because it was the truest thing he could give her, and he knew it. "I know," she said. Her voice was steady. "Barely. I know you won't." Reverend Cook completed the ceremony. Dolan cheered with the wholehearted enthusiasm of a man who had been waiting for this specific moment since approximately the 2nd week of November. Helen cried openly and made no apologies for it. The 30 people in the church did the thing that people do in small communities when something goes right. After a long time of things going sideways, they relaxed collectively like a held breath finally released. Dog. That evening, sitting at the kitchen table, with the last of the celebration food between them and Dolan's voice carrying from the bunkhouse where he was apparently telling the story of the Garrett negotiation to anyone who would listen, Clara opened her notebook. Eli looked at it across the table. "What's that?" "I wrote down everything I knew about you when I was on the train," she said. "The first list, after the letters." She turned to the page. "Do you want to hear it?" He looked at her with the expression that was entirely his own. Not quite a smile, more than a look, something that lived in the space between the two. "Does it say anything accurate?" "Some of it," she said. "A lot of it is wrong." She ran her finger down the page. "I wrote that you were probably guarded. That was right. I wrote that you were probably set in your habits." She glanced up. "Also right." "What were you wrong about?" she considered. "I thought honesty was the only thing you had to offer." She closed the notebook. "I didn't understand yet that it was the foundation of all the other things. That it doesn't start replacing them, it's what makes room for them." He looked at her steadily. "What other things?" "Patience," she said. "Steadiness. The coffee before I ask. The south porch railing." She paused. "The forget-me-not." He was quiet. "Eli," she said, "you're a good man. I don't think anyone said that to you plainly in a long time." He looked at the table. "No," he said. "They haven't." "Well," she said, "consider it said." She reached across the table and set her hand flat on the worn wood between them, not reaching for his. Just present, just there available, the way she'd learned to be, not pressing, just offering. The way you hold a rope like a decision, the way you make room for something without forcing it through. His hand covered hers. Outside, the Montana dark was doing what it always did, spreading itself vast and absolute over everything. No apologies, no concessions to what the people inside the lit windows were doing or feeling or building. The silence that Eli had warned her about in his second letter was there, enormous as always. And she sat inside it and found that it felt as it had for weeks now, like exactly the right size. She was 23 years old, and she had mailed herself into the unknown and built something real in the place she landed, and the man across the table from her was not what she'd expected, and not what she'd imagined. And she had decided better than either, because he was actual and present and hers, and she was his freely, and with full information, and without a single reservation, she hadn't examined and resolved. Clara Whitman had come to Montana with 11 letters in a trunk and 22 days of emergency money, and she had turned it into a life, not the life that circumstance had tried to hand her. Not the life that desperation would have settled for, but the one she had walked toward with her eyes open, and her hands steady, and her mind absolutely clear about what she was choosing and exactly why. That was the thing that mattered. Not luck, not rescue, not the accident of a kind man or a workable ranch or a town small enough to need her. What mattered was the deliberate, informed, eyes-wide-open choosing of a woman who understood that the right life doesn't find you, it requires you, and who had required it with everything she had. She had chosen. She had built. She had stayed. And in the end, that was the only love story worth telling. Not the one that happens to you, but the one you decide to make true.